was a study done in about 1972 or 71 by, an Anglican minister up in Auckland, and he did this amazing study in the early 70s, which was a much more open time than it is today. And he interviewed people all through the country and did all these amazing things. And that was like over 30 years ago. That was the last time this kind of work's been done, and it's, well, time it's done again. So I ended up combining the methods of research, combining the quantitative method where you ask questions with the qualitative method where you actually talk to people, and that's kind of the system that we ended up with. Okay, just going to talk a little bit here about the participants in that quantitative way. Just tell you a little bit about some of just the basic sort of stuff that you tend to think about, when we're looking at cannabis use. And there's a couple of reasons for doing this. One of them is that, as I've said, we tend to think about, or cannabis use and users tend to be constructed in a certain way. And by asking these kinds of questions with regard to demographics, for example, maybe we can get an understanding that the group of people we're talking about is actually broader than the assumption that we have, that the phenomenon is a youth phenomenon, and that there are certain types of people. So maybe we can move away from stereotypes if we start to do this. We can also, by asking these questions, we can engage with the epidemiological data that's already there, and we can offer an alternative information, but in the same type of data. And the other important thing we can do is make some decision about whether or not the group of people that we're talking with is actually representative of the general population. So we're getting away from this idea of talking about our mates and talking to our mates. We're moving more towards the idea that if we can get some information, then we can say, well, maybe this is information that goes more broadly, and maybe that might feed into other areas of study or research. It might also feed into policy, and we might get people thinking more about the kinds of ideas we have about cannabis use, and that maybe we can move away from some of these more limited ideas that I felt at the time, and I still feel are there. So that's some of the reasons for looking at that. The second point there, the skews. We have to think, it's all well and good to say, oh, these guys represent this group pretty well, but is there anything in there that maybe suggests they might be a different group of people? So we need to think about that. I've included abuse and dependence because these are terms that are very much medical terms, and those are used to characterise people. This person is a drug abuser. This person is dependent on cannabis. What does this mean? They're very powerful terms. They're medical instruments that are applied. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is used through a series of questions to get at how a person relates to the substance that they're using, and as a consequence, a picture is built up. And if someone is labelled a cannabis abuser or a cannabis dependent, these are very powerful labels, and they impact majorly on how people think about people. And then we move on to looking at styles of use and culture and so on. Just a few figures and facts, straightforward. There were 80 face-to-face interviews. Of those, 76 also followed up with questionnaires. The questionnaires were these huge things that have been developed overseas. There were 650 questions, and as Abe mentioned, he was actually part of the study. I sort of don't normally talk about anybody who was part of the study, but seeing as you've fessed up, mate, I think we don't have to pretend that you didn't do it. So he can tell you how that was, but it took quite a long time to go through the questionnaire. The interviews came first, and the questionnaires followed with a minimum of a week gap. Just a few facts there about, or some data there about the types of the sort of style or form of use there, with the median age of first use around about 16, which is kind of standard throughout the world, so there's no great surprises there. Demographics, again, just a little bit of a look at the sort of people we've got there. Probably the biggest one, we'll get to this in a minute, is the difference between males and females, with males predominating. And interestingly enough, the health and teaching professions were the professions most prominently represented in the study. Significant proportion of people were either full-time or part-time employed. Similarly, there were a significant number of people who were students. About 26% of the sample were students. So there's and tertiary students. So there's quite a lot of people doing those activities. In terms of unemployment, the unemployment group were pretty close to the average of Dunedin at the time. The sickness and invalid beneficiaries were up a little bit, and there was a bit of medicinal use, people with back pain and stuff like that, and that sort of came through in the study as well. Generally representative of the Dunedin population and of cannabis users, so I think that's quite a useful thing. Couple of skews of things we need to think is maybe differentiate the sample a little bit. Quite a high using group, as you can see by those figures there. Almost half of them are daily users. 30% used at least weekly. Similarly, 25% there had been arrested and 21% convicted. So those kinds of statistics make you think, well, are there other reasons why this group wanted to be involved in the study? And you have to acknowledge that when you're doing this kind of stuff. And not surprisingly, they were overall a rather enthusiastic group with regard to their use of cannabis. And so those are the kinds of narratives that you tend to get. Now, that doesn't invalidate the data. It just simply says, well, when we're talking about these people are enthusiastic about what they're doing. But hey, they also seem to represent other aspects of the general Dunedin community. Now, this is I mentioned this a little bit earlier. One of the problems with using these kinds of tools, the DSM-4 as it's called there, is that you've got to know what you're doing. I suspect there might be people in the audience who would suggest that a lot of people don't even do that. But the questionnaire that I had from which I took the questions that generated these data had used a combination of the DSM, which is an American tool for testing people's dependence, etc., and a European version, and they combined the two, called the ICD-10. They combined the two, and they kind of made a hybrid instrument, which they then used in their questionnaire. So they kind of took a really complicated thing, they took bits off and they chucked these other bits onto it, and it didn't work very well, but because I didn't know much about that stuff at the time, I used their same instrument. And one of the main things is that normally you ask these questions that you can see up there, plus a couple more that aren't there, over a period of a year. But the questionnaire that I used had it over a lifetime. And so it might be, for instance, that question number one there, you felt that in the dependence criteria, you felt the desire to cut down. That might have happened 1 year, and then 2 years later you might have had another one of the criteria. So in actual fact, this is probably a very conservative diagnosis, if we can even call it a diagnosis, of the level of dependence and abuse there was in the study. And some of these things also, like for instance, this one here, had recurring legal problems. Well, is this something inherent about a human being, or is it something to do with the justice system? So this is where these tools, which are ostensibly a scientific tool, actually have a political component, and one has to question the extent to which that sort of thing invalidates it as an instrument, or as a criterion anyway. Now, another thing I was able to do with the questionnaire was talk about styles of use. And so what I've got here is the 5 top sort of methods by which people used at different periods of their use careers. As you can see, if we look at the first year of use, joints are pretty high, if I'm allowed to use that term. And then as we move on to the last 3 months, the proportion of people using a joint has actually gone down to 15%, whereas some of these other methods increase, like there's the bong, spotting, that goes up a little bit, using a pipe, that goes up, it almost doubles, in fact it does double. So what you're seeing here is a change in patterns of use, and one of the arguments about user culture as an actual fact is actually quite complicated. It's not just some simple process where we only have to ask 5 questions and we know about it. It's actually quite a complicated process, and there's a whole bunch of other methods under there as well that I haven't included. I forgot to include in here a fantastic set of slides that one of the participants sent me of a thing called the lung. How many people know what a lung is here, just out of interest? Oh my goodness. Very informed audience we have here tonight. Surprise, surprise. So anyway, I hadn't encountered the lung previously, and it's an amazing instrument, filthy bloody thing as far as I can see. But anyway, for some people it was actually their preferred method of ingestion, and it involves cutting the bottom off a 1.5 Coke litre bottle. For those 2 or 3 of you who don't know what this is, and you tape a bread bag on the bottom of it and tie a string to that, and you poke this up inside the bottle, and you've got your cone at the top, and then you draw it out. It's like a bucket bomb without water. And then you go woof, and away you go, and you've got this thing. And there were 2 people in the study who that was their preferred method of use. And good on them was all I can say. All right.